Caitríona, Katty, I don't know about you guys, but I literally don't know what day of the week it is, what time of day it is. I am exhausted all the time, I have to admit. How are you guys getting through?
Yeah, this is why for the last three presidential elections, I've now covered six of them. I have said this is my last election because it's a bit like giving birth.
Well, that's
you
worked.
forget how exhausting it is. If it cheers you up at all, I did get a text from a senior campaign official on the Harris campaign this morning saying that they were almost dead and couldn't speak anymore because they are so tired. So maybe they're even more tired on the campaigns than we are.
It's the time zones as well, though, isn't it? Like you're hopping between time zones and you're trying to calculate what time is it where I'm supposed to be and where I'm speaking and what. There's a lot of maths in your brain.
Exactly,
Yeah,
and we're
my brain
journalists
is
for a
not up to
reason.
that. Yeah, because we're not mathematicians.
Nope. And this is, of course, Path to the Presidency. We're meeting weekly to talk about what we're looking at in the election in the lead up to election night, where the three of us are going to be in the studio together, of course. And Caitríona, you're in Arizona. Tell us what you've been seeing there.
Yes, I am here in Tucson, Arizona. As we're speaking, I'm actually in the Student Union Center of the University of Arizona Tucson campus, where I've been speaking to students. This is part of our Voter Voices series, Sumi, that you and I have been doing, and other colleagues will be doing as well. Just taking the temperature of voters in these key swing states, sometimes vote Republican, sometimes vote Democrat, just to see, are the polls right? Do they feel like that on the ground? And what issues are driving people? And I can say I've been here now for 3 days, and it would feel as close as the polls say it is. You meet a Harris voter, you quickly meet a Trump voter, you meet a Harris voter, you meet a Trump voter. And of course, in this state in Arizona, there are slightly more registered Republican voters than Democrats. But there are 3 in 10 voters who consider themselves to be independent. So that's quite a big chunk of people who, you know, go between different candidates for different races as well. I've spoken to a lot of people who feel like they're going to vote one way for the president and then vote for the other party down the ticket, because you also have 2 of the most competitive House races in this state and a quite competitive Senate seat race as well. We're right beside the border, of course, so that is a big issue here as well. And Arizona has the issue of abortion on the ballot. So in addition to all those elected representatives, people here will also be voting on 13 propositions, is what they're called. They're basically laws that they want to change. And one of those is to change the state constitution and enshrine in it the right to an abortion up until the point of viability. So that's considered to be somewhere between 22 and 24 weeks. Currently, abortion is allowed up until 15 weeks here.
Caitríona, I spent quite a lot of time in Arizona just before the midterm elections in 2022. And one thing that is interesting about Arizona, I thought, compared to the kind of blue wall states, is that it's a very much more fluid population. You've got a lot of people coming into the state. You've got kind of Republicans who don't like California moving to Arizona for lower taxes. Obviously, you've got a big immigrant population. Do you get a sense that the population of the state has changed much in the last 4 years, and in any way that it might kind of help either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Do people talk about that?
That's exactly it, Katty. I met a Republican from California just this morning who moved here for the reasons you're mentioning.
Political refugees.
Yeah, I've met 3 people who moved here from Pennsylvania as well, 2 from Connecticut. So it feels like people come from all over the country to Arizona. And I can see why. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I mean, it's extremely hot today, middle of October. It's still, I mean, at 8 o'clock this morning, it was like 25 degrees Celsius, you know, and it gets, obviously we know, boiling during summertime here. But there's a lot going for Arizona, but there is a really, really mixed population, as you say there. About a quarter of the population would be members of the Latino community. So that's obviously a key constituency that we've seen Harris and Trump courting as well. And you've got a big immigrant population here as well. And people move around the state, but there is really a sense here that people are quite upset with both candidates, I would have to say. You know, I mean, there are solid Trump voters and solid Harris voters, but a lot of people just aren't happy with either of them.
You know what I was wondering, looking at that, that you're in Arizona and abortion being on the ballot. You know, there are 10 states in this election cycle where abortion is on the ballot. And, you know, you have states like Florida and Arizona. And, you know, looking at the way that people feel about abortion across the country, I wonder if abortion would be enough to change how people vote on the presidential election, but also down ballot in some of those important House races that you mentioned in that critical Senate race in Arizona. How much does it actually drive the way that people are going to vote in a state like Arizona? Is that something people have told you?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about that. I have to say the voters here are really engaged. I think because they have so much to vote on this time around. I mean, the voter guidance pack is 300 pages thick. It's like a phone
Wow.
directory. Yeah, it's huge. And, on that issue of abortion, the Proposition 139, there are 35 pages of people who've submitted reasons why you should vote for it, and something like 28 pages of people who say why you shouldn't. So the electorate is really
Do they
engaged.
think anyone's actually reading that?
Well, I mean, you would think that, right? But I've met so many people who say, yeah, they will. And there's a lot of early mail-in voting here as well. And people say because there's so much to vote on, they actually want to, sit at home, do it over a few days, read bits and bobs of the booklet, and then cast their vote there. But as to whether it would dictate turnout or how people vote, I've met a lot of people who say they're going to vote for enshrining those abortion rights, but they're also going to vote for Donald Trump, which was quite interesting, I thought. And I met another few voters who said they were going to vote against that, who are very pro-life and very conservative Republican voters, and they're going to vote for Donald Trump. And they're actually upset at how he has kind of dragged the Republican Party's position on abortion to be, as one woman said to me, more liberal than I would like it to be. But, it's still better than kind of full permission. So it's really interesting dynamics here.
Caitríona, why do you think I spent a great day with Carrie Lake when I was down there filming, and I mean, she's an extraordinary kind of retail politician. I was with her in a kind of retirement community, one of those big communities that they've built, and she was just charming the pants off everybody at this kind of lunch reception for her. And yet she's clearly behind in that Senate race there. What do you think that's about? Is she putting her foot in it? Do people not like her? Do they see her as too extreme? Is Ruben Gallego, who's the Democratic candidate, a much better candidate? Why do you think she's polling so far behind Donald Trump in Arizona?
Yeah, I think there's a range of reasons that people have said to me. And again, it's not a scientific, cross-section poll. It's just various people I've met going around the state here, is that Gallego is kind of, maybe you'd call him a moderate Democrat. He has positions that are more into the middle rather than quite left. So he appeals across the spectrum. And a lot of people have said, when they describe Carrie Lake to me, they say shouty. And that she kind of comes across as a bit aggressive, and that they don't like that. But it's really interesting because the polls have obviously Harris and Trump so close, with Trump slightly edging it, but again, probably within the margin of error. But almost all the polls have Gallego, the Democratic Senate candidate, 6, 7, 8, 9% ahead of Carrie Lake. So quite a distance there. So, I mean, I think Arizona is going to be really one to watch on election night for a whole pile of reasons.
Well, I have been a lot further away than Arizona, although I love Arizona because I love the desert and the warmth, and I've had some very happy times there reporting. It's great. I've been in the UK for the last week, which seems a bit of an odd place to go and cover a US election, but I was doing a tour with my podcast, The Rest is Politics, US, with Anthony Scaramucci. And the thing that blew me away was how much interest there is in this election. I mean, you talk about the interest I know in Arizona. We were in London in a stadium and 13,000 people turned out to the O2 Stadium to come and listen to four nerds talk about politics, two of them talking about the American election. I don't know, maybe people didn't have something else to do on Tuesday night, but it was really, and it was kind of both bewildering and a reminder of the amazing level of interest that people have in this election in particular. And we had so many questions from people who came to these shows, and we were in Manchester and Glasgow and Cardiff and London, and everywhere people are just fascinated. And some of it's the US system, and some of it, of course, is Donald Trump. People are fascinated by Donald Trump. They were questions about the money in American politics, questions about why US elections take so long. But then there were super specific questions as well about what can we tell from early voting in Pennsylvania, and what does it actually mean for the outcome of the election? I mean, honestly, people know more about the American election than is probably good for them at this point.
I absolutely saw that.
The advice to stop watching the polls.
In Germany as well. I remember in 2008, Barack Obama came to Tiergarten in Berlin, and he held a rally. There were nearly 200,000 people at that rally.
We didn't quite get 200,000.
But you're getting there. You're going to get
time.
Bring Barack Obama with you. You might do it, actually. And I remember people around me in the crowd talking about the intricacies of the American electoral system. And it was remarkable to me how much people there were not only curious about, but invested in the American electoral system in a way that many Americans themselves are not. And there's this understanding that, every single vote in the US matters everywhere else in the world, doesn't it? And people understand the weight and the impact of US elections. Plus, it's fun, the horse race of a US election, and people are interested in watching.
And I think, I'm sure you guys would agree when you travel around the country, like we're here in Arizona, we've been in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and so on. People are astounded when they hear you've come from the BBC and you're from Ireland and you want to talk to them about their election. They kind of find that mind-boggling. Like, why would you come so far away to talk to us? That there is that level of interest. But I think, as you say, Sumi, it impacts the rest of the world, what happens here and who's in the White House, particularly how much power the president has when it comes to foreign policy, right?
Yeah, I think that's always the case. Look, we all know that what happens at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue affects our listeners around the world and our viewers around the world and other countries in a way that is just not true of any other capital. It's not true of London. It's not true of Beijing in the same way. It's not true of Moscow in the same way, or Paris or Berlin in the same way. So there's always been, every election I've covered, there's been a lot of international interest. The thing I found different in the questions when we were on tour last week were the number of questions about the prospect for political violence after the election. And that is a post January the 6th question, and it's not something that's come up in other elections. And this idea that, what will democracy in America look like? And some of it is catastrophizing a little bit, I think, but some of it are genuine questions about how would a Trump presidency change the systems of American government? Will there be a peaceful transfer of power? Will Donald Trump concede if he loses? What are we were getting lots of questions about what legal suits have been filed. In states like the one you're in, Caitríona, in Arizona, that might show that there's going to be some kind of long drawn out process after the election. And that is new. That's something that I haven't heard. On the question of political violence, I remember spending a day actually in Arizona, Caitríona, in a Trump merchandise shop, the biggest Trump merchandise shop in America. It's about 4 hours outside Phoenix, and they were doing a roaring trade in kind of Trump cutout models and T-shirts with Mike Pence behind bars on them and all the kind of usual stuff. Yeah. But it was run by this lovely couple, Steve and Mary, and I remember asking them, what would happen if the Republicans lost the midterms? And they said, they would take up arms. They had guns and they were prepared to use them. And it was the most detailed description of how a civil war would start in America that I've ever heard. And it came in the lovely state that you're in, Caitríona. And I haven't heard that much. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I heard it before 2022 and it didn't happen after 2022, and we're hearing a bit of it now. But it was fascinating to me that question is being asked around the world, and people are looking at America's democracy as something a little bit more fragile and not as certain. And what does that mean for other countries if America is not what it's been for the last 70 years?
I was speaking to a group of young men this morning who'd just come off a night shift in one of the big factories here, and they were very mixed in terms of backgrounds and ethnicities and so on. And I asked them, had they been to any Trump or Harris rallies? And a couple of them said, no, I wouldn't go. I'm concerned about violence. I would be concerned about something happening at a rally. And I just thought that was, it's a shocking kind of indictment of where things are at in this country.
Oh, yeah. It is. And January 6th did really change the frame, not only here in the US, but of course around the world. As you said, Katty, this is a concern people have. If you look at it, there have been conversations about this already on the campaign trail and in the many interviews that the candidates have been doing, right? And you've seen, for example, Vice Presidential pick J.D. Vance asked multiple times in multiple ways if Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, and he hasn't fully answered that question. He's avoided answering that question. And Donald Trump has been asked, will there be a peaceful transfer of power? And he says, well, in 2020, there was a peaceful transfer of power, and that he continues to say falsely that nobody died on January 6th. And so it does, of course, raise concern if this is still the narrative through which we're looking at things from the Trump campaign, the last election. Does that then ripen the ground again for some sort of violence? It does feel, I don't know what the sense is that you guys get, but it does feel like authorities are far more prepared for that this time because of January 6th.
Well, if you look just around Washington, D.C. already, there are barricades going up and fences going up that I don't remember having seen at this point before. I mean, some structures go up ahead of the inauguration, but we're months away from that. But you can't get anywhere near the White House now. Like the area right in front there of Lafayette Park, where on many election nights I've been down there when the result has come in, chatting to people who've gathered there, and some are upset and some are happy. That area is totally locked down, so there won't be that same kind of celebration, commiseration outside the White House, and that is absolutely as a result of what happened in that city on the 6th of January.
I don't know that we would see the same, and Donald Trump has suggested that he, wouldn't be rallying forces in the way that he did, as I listened to that speech on January the 6th. But I think the more likely than a kind of another January the 6th type scenario is sort of more vigilante type activity against people who are thought to have stolen the election, if that's the way that it is framed after January the 6th.
Sumi, what have you been thinking about this week?
It actually plays right into what we were just talking about, which is election integrity and concerns around this election. And I've been thinking about and listening to what some of the agencies are that have been tasked with making sure that the U.S. election is safe and secure. And look, those agencies have been, hitting the media trail, trying to convince people and assure people as well that this election will be safe and secure. And there are a number of agencies that are charged with this, including, for example, the Department of Homeland Security. But earlier, the DHS did put out a report saying that they've seen the number of warnings that they've had to issue to political candidates, to government leaders targeted by foreign groups has risen significantly. So, I mean, compared to the midterms, which is the last election, obviously, we saw in 2022, it is a presidential election. So you do see that uptick in threats from foreign adversaries. But they pointed specifically to Iran, Russia, and China and said Russia is really deemed the biggest threat there. But we also know that Donald Trump has been briefed about threats to assassinate him by Iranian threats to assassinate him, and that the U.S. government has warned Iran as well about this. And, there are certainly things that the DHS and CISA, which is a cybersecurity agency of the government, have been doing. So they say that they have been out and about kind of training election workers. They've been in pretty much every state speaking to the secretaries of state about making sure that their election systems are working and that, they are able to alert authorities if there is a threat. But I went to a Senate hearing back in May in the Senate Intelligence Committee that they had about 2024 election threats. And I think what's really interesting is the domestic threat as well, right? Because we've talked a lot about the fact that, or just now, all of us have just talked about the threat that we might see of violence, perhaps. And we have a great piece on our website by our colleague Mike Wendling about, poll workers and personnel and concerns that they have on election night as well. And, all of this can help raise that sense or that concern that there is something that is going to be affected in the election or in the outcome, even though authorities keep saying that's certainly not the case. But I was thinking about the fact, the three of us will be in the studio on election night. And what about, misinformation and disinformation? What if a video comes out on election night of Donald Trump purporting to be Donald Trump saying, okay, I'm dropping out of the race. Now, obviously, the three of us are going to be sitting here relying on our colleagues, and we have our great BBC Verify team. But who is responsible at that point to say, this is not Donald Trump, this is misinformation, this is disinformation, and we need to debunk this immediately? And I think the concern I have is it's not entirely clear to me who's responsible for that, and that can put us, of course, but really voters, most importantly, in a tricky spot.
Sumi, what are they doing as well to protect election workers? There was a lot of talk after 2020 and even around 2022 about how hard it had got harder to recruit volunteers and people to work at polling stations and stuff. Are they taking kind of extra efforts this time around to try and protect poll workers and poll counters?
Yeah, we talked to the head of CISA, Jen Easterly, and she talked about the fact that they've actually been doing this for, not just in the direct lead up to this election, but for months now, in several months ahead of 2024, to make sure that they have a solid infrastructure on the ground. And that means also working with poll workers that they feel that they are supported by the local election infrastructure, but also federal election infrastructure. And so that means also making sure that they are trained to know what to do if there is a threat, for example, or how to make sure that they're secure if they feel like they are that their safety is at threat.
This issue of election integrity is another one actually that the people I've been speaking to here in Arizona have raised with me, because again, they have a number of issues on the ballot that they'll have to vote for, more of these propositions that are around election security and election integrity. Of course, a few dozen people faced charges in the wake of 2020, charged with interfering in the process and the electoral college process, pro-Trump supporters. So it's something that's very to the forefront of people's minds here. And it was striking as well, voters here said to me, which I hadn't heard to the same extent from voters in the other states I've been in, about how concerned they were about misinformation and disinformation. And it's interesting to see some people who only get their news, let's say, from one or two media channels, and I'd ask them why were they, voting for Donald Trump over Kamala Harris, and then they would repeat to me these sentences using a certain type of language that are Republican talking points. Like a few people talking about how Kamala Harris delivers a word salad whenever she speaks. I mean, that's not really a way that most people speak in conversation. It's kind of like a talking point that they're hearing from somewhere. So I think the role of the media, the social media, these echo chambers, and to your point, Sumi, about who tells on election night whether something is faked or not. I mean, I think that there's no one to do that, really. I mean, that's so many battles we see up on Capitol Hill about the responsibility of social media companies and the absence of an independent regulator.
Yeah, and obviously, if the election is very, very tight in Arizona and in the other battleground states and nationally as well, in terms of the Electoral College, and the process goes on for a while, I think the longer it goes on, the more vacuum there is, the more counts and calls for recounts. And I think that's where all of these lawsuits that have been filed preemptively, particularly on the Trump side, but then you've got counter lawsuits from the Democrats as well, adds to this sense of that there could be insecurity, because it's that kind of window where there's a vacuum that that you might have bad actors step in, as we saw in places like Georgia last time. I remember being down in Georgia and interviewing poll workers, and they'd had bomb threats at various polling stations like a week or two. I mean, this was between the polling day and then they had that special Senate election, but there was a very febrile atmosphere in the state for weeks after the election, and the poor poll workers, who are non-partisan poll workers, had these bomb threats that the FBI took so seriously that they told this woman, lovely woman, to say, okay, you need to park your car right outside. She had a ground floor office. You need to park your vehicle right outside your office window, so that if there is a bomb threat, then that will mitigate some of the blast from the bomb, and you'll be a little bit protected from the shattering glass. I mean,
Wow.
This woman, she said that she wouldn't leave the office to walk through the car park at night if it was dark. Her husband came and accompanied they got a whole group of other people to come and accompany them to their cars because they were so worried. And that, again, I mean, to get to our point about the kind of rather depressing state of politics, that when poll workers who aren't partisan and don't, vote, don't ostensibly come from either Democratic or Republican side, and just as civil servants trying to do their job. But the longer this gets drawn out after November the 5th, the longer we don't have a result, I think the more the chances are for some sense of insecurity around these polling locations and the counting process, exactly as we saw in Georgia last time.
That is indeed the concern. And if you listen to what some of these election authorities are saying, they're trying to prepare everyone in advance by saying, look, we're not going to have official results on election night. Remember that it will take longer. We do have early voting, mail-in ballots that will be counted on the day of course. But I had seen this poll from NPR Marist poll from earlier this month. And I'm just going to look over what the numbers again. It said almost 6 in 10 Americans say they're concerned or very concerned that there will be voter fraud in this election. And I just found that remarkable, because that means that some of that misinformation about the security of the last election really has seeped in, hasn't it? And at that point, if people do not trust that this will be a fair, safe, secure election, that is really troubling, of course, for any democracy, and one that's especially going to be such a close race. As you said, Katty, to your point, the longer we have to wait for a result, the more that there is the threat of some sort of unrest, whether that be violence or more misinformation or disinformation. That's the real concern here.
Well, that was a really cheerful episode.
Yeah,
of this
let's hope for the best,
path
guys.
to the presidency. Next week we'll bring you, the cheery stuff.
Humanity. Yeah, let's put our belief in humankind.
We promise we'll be better next week.